Alright, so we got our easing in here. The next thing that we're going to work on is called squash and stretch, because when the ball actually hits the ground, it should squash a little bit. And it's going to depend on what sort of ball that we're working with, on how much squash and stretch it has, but every ball should have at least a tiny bit of squash and stretch. Even a bowling ball, I would probably do like just a slight amount of squash and stretch when it hits the ground, just so you kind of feel it, but not necessarily see it. But we'll pretend that this is more like one of those rubber recess balls. So we'll have a fair amount of squash and stretch when it hits the ground. Now we want to think about when it would squash and when it would stretch for each one of these. So we'll start with our squash first. And our squash should happen, right when it touches on the ground. So when it hits the ground, it needs to flatten out a little bit. And then whenever it lifts back off, it's going to stretch out a little bit to represent that. And the stretch should actually be a little bit less than the squash because there's not as much force working against it. So to do that, we're going to need our scale property. But we really only need our position and scale for this. And although we've only got one layer in here right now, so it's not going to make too much of a difference, it's still a good idea to work with as clean of a layer and timeline system as possible. So instead of expanding the whole layer out like we did before to see all the transform properties, we're going to focus on just position and scale properties. But first, let's go ahead and rename our layer. So to rename your layer, I know that the way that seems the most intuitive to do that is to double click on it, but it's not always a good idea to do that. When you do that in After Effects, it'll actually open up what's called layer view mode, and instead you're going to get like a big solid color in here because you're only viewing the layer. This is sort of like After Effects' isolation mode, if you're familiar with isolation mode from Illustrator. If you do this, don't freak out, don't panic, and whatever you do, don't hit Command Z or go to Edit Undo to get rid of it, because you're not changing anything within the document, you're just changing the layout of the interface. All you need to do is either close out this tab or just switch back to the other tab, because all it did was it opened up that layer on its own. So it's not actually changing anything, and if you start hitting Command Z, you're going to lose all the good work that you've done. Instead, to change the name of this layer, you're going to select it and hit Return. Then you could type in ball, since it's going to be our bouncing ball. You can also call it bouncing ball if you'd like. So now that we've changed our layer, let's narrow this down to just being our position and scale properties. So to get your position property, you're going to hit the letter P, as in position. And to get your scale properties show up, you're going to hit the letter S for scale. Now when you do this, it's only going to show you one at a time. So either P or S. So let's say, for instance, we have just position showing up. Now, if we want scale to show up with position, after you enable position to be visible by hitting P, you're going to hold down the Shift key and press S. And that'll make scale show up as well. So press P to get your position, then hold down the Shift key and press S to see scale as well. Now what you want to do from here is we need to start enabling the scale property to have keyframes on it. And wherever you turn this stopwatch on, that's where it's going to put its first keyframe in. So I'm actually going to go back to the beginning again. And I'm going to enable my keyframes for scale right up here. Then let's move to frame 10. This is where the ball actually hits the ground. It's sometimes called the contact position, where you're either like a person's foot or a ball or something like that comes in contact with the ground. And this is where we're going to want it to squash. Now what we don't want is we don't want it to slowly squash as it's going from the top to the bottom, because that's not how it would work. It would squash pretty much from frame 9 to frame 10. So instead, I'm going to go back one frame, and I need to add in a keyframe here at the current value. Now this is what always screws people up, because everyone thinks, okay, well what I'm going to do is to add another keyframe in, is click the stopwatch again. But what that would do is it would actually get rid of my first keyframe. Remember, this is an on-off switch, not an add-remove keyframe switch. The add-remove keyframe switch is actually to the left over here. This little diamond right here, and when you hover over it, it will say add or remove keyframe at current time. So go ahead and click that diamond for frame 9 right before the ball hits the ground. and then move forward, and we're going to, on frame 10, we're going to lower our y value, which is the second value, and we'll have to raise our x value because, when you're squashing it, that volume needs to go somewhere. It can't just flatten out and then be smaller. Okay, so it's kind of a push-pull relationship. Now to do this, if you try to start adjusting these now, it's going to do a uniform scale on them. And that's because they're constrained, which is what this little icon right here says. And when you hover over it, it'll say constrained proportions. To get rid of that, go ahead and just click on it. And that'll allow you to individually control your X and Y scale. So I'm going to set my Y scale to be 75%. And then I'm going to take that 25% from there and add it to here. So it's going to be 125 and 75. Now, unfortunately, we've created a little bit of a problem for ourselves now. It was hitting the ground before, and now it's floating up. The reason that is because our transform or anchor point, which you should be familiar with already from Photoshop and Illustrator. It's where things scale and rotate and skew from. It's the point of origin for them. And right now it's set for the center of our ball, so when I lower my scale or raise my scale, it's going to do it evenly on all sides. It's not quite what we wanted. We wanted it down at the bottom here. So what we need to do is we need to basically shift our anchor point down to the bottom of the ball. We've already started animating, and that can throw off our animation a little bit. So the best way to handle this is actually with something called the anchor point property. That'll allow us to actually shift the layer but leave the anchor point in the same spot. Now at first this is going to seem like a bit of an error because it's going to make our ball even higher off the ground. But what that's going to do is it's going to make it easier for us to have it in the right spot from this point forward once we adjust it a little bit. So to get our anchor point property to show up, we're going to leave position and scale here, and we'll hit Shift and A for anchor point. And what we want to do is we want to raise our Y value a little bit until this crosshair is aligned to the bottom of our ball. Now, as I was saying before, this unfortunately does seem like it's counterproductive. It seems like it's kind of working in the opposite direction. But what it's really doing for us is it's making sure that everything squashes from this point rather than the center. So now, as I adjust the height of my ball, you can see that the bottom of it stays put, which is what we want. And it's still centered horizontally, so both sides will squash out or stretch out in the same sort of way. Now the other thing we need to do is we need to physically lower this ball back down to the ground. We're going to have to do it for every single one of these keyframes. I know, kind of a nightmare, but there's an easier way to handle this as well. What you want to do instead is go ahead and shift select all these lower keyframes, and then shift select the keyframe that we're currently on as well. And then you can just physically drag them all down. And this way you can do all of it at the same time. So this is one of the advantageous systems of working with position frames in After Effects. You have the ability to change multiple points in time at the same time. It's like working in the fourth dimension. It's great. It makes things a lot easier as opposed to having to physically drag the playhead to each one of these points and then drag them down one at a time. So now we've got our anchor point fixed, and once again our ball is going to be bouncing on the ground. What we need to do now is we need to fix the stretch a little bit. So before it was, or currently it's staying the same shape the whole way down and squashing when it hits the ground. And really it should be stretching out a little bit as it's moving down in this direction. Now it shouldn't be as much as the squash, so 75, 125, doing the opposite of that would be a bit too much. So instead we're going to do, on this keyframe right before it hits, we'll do 80 for the width and 120 for the height. And that way it stretches out as it goes down and then suddenly squashes when it hits the ground. Perfect. Then on the bounce back up, we want it to be at 100% at the top here. And around about halfway or so, we want it to be, once again, stretched out so that gravity is kind of pulling it down as it's moving itself up. So it's almost like a blur at that point. So around frame 14 or 15, we'll set a similar number. We'll do the same numbers again. We'll do 80 and 120. And that way it stretches back up again. And when we get to the top, you can either type in 100, 100 here, but if you want to use that trick we used in one of our previous videos, you can right-click and choose Reset, and that'll set it back to being 100%, 100%. Then we just need to repeat it over and over again. Or we could do something much easier. We can copy and paste these frames over and over again. So they continue to, we could just reuse what we have already. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and instead of incrementally moving for each one of these bounces and adjusting in that sort of way, we'll just copy what we have already and then we'll paste it to each one. So I'm going to select everything from, actually we'll do all of my scale keyframes. And there's two different ways we can do this. Since we're doing all of them, you can either click and drag out a bounding box to select them all. You can shift select each one. But if you're doing all the keyframes, what my favorite thing to do is if you click on the name of the property, that'll actually select all the keyframes for you that way. Then you can hit Command C. Go up to the edit menu, you'll see Command C is the hotkeys for copy. It's the same hotkeys for copy in every other program I've ever worked with. Command C. And when you paste it, it's always going to paste it based on, it'll always paste the first keyframe wherever the playhead is. So you want to move your playhead to frame 20. That's going to paste this keyframe over top of this keyframe. But they're the same value, so it won't matter. It's going to be exactly what we want. So place your playhead at frame 20, which should be the height of the second bounce. And then edit paste or the hotkeys Command V as in victory. Then you don't have to copy again. It's still in your clipboard. You can move over another 20 frames, Command V, of the 20 frames, Command V, and just keep going until you reach the end. If you have some extra ones like mine, you can just select them and hit delete on your keyboard to get rid of them. So now we have not only easing, but also a squash and stretch. And it's still not completely there, but it feels a little bit like it's jumping now, and it feels a little bit more lively. It's a little bit more believable. It's kind of a very rubbery ball.